everyone sort of settles in, because we have so much we're doing, and I want to make sure we have space to get through it all, I just want to start by thanking you for being here at RICO in Portland. I know things have felt a little bit hectic recently. I don't know, it almost is like we have to catch up on something maybe over the past few years. So it feels really special that you all have taken 2 days right before Expo to kind of slow things down and think about stuff all together, kind of push us forward. We think of RICO as a little bit of a container, in the sense that we work really hard for a year building a program, trying to do a specific thing when all of you are in the room, but we really don't know how that's going to work until you're here and you're engaging with the program. So in that sense, all of you are contributing to the experience that we're going to have over the next 2 days, and you being here is really integral to making what RICO is. I also really quickly want to take a moment to thank the partners who helped us build this experience. Like I said, it's been a lot of people and a lot of work over about a year now. So briefly, I just want you to join me in thanking Toddy, Fetco, Simonelli Group, Mir, Pentair, Tasteify, Center Cafe, Verve, Snapchill, Monan, Minus, Taika, Fresh Fizz, Stumptown, and Onyx. Like I said, it's been a lot of people who have pulled this all together. So, my job right now in this very moment is to kind of get us all into what we've been calling a RICO headspace. And I know it's a little bit early for somebody to be standing on stage and talking to you about something like headspace, but it's really integral to what we're going to do today. Because all of you have traveled some kind of physical distance to get here, whether you flew halfway around the world or just halfway across town on the Max. And now we need to do a little bit of that mental transitioning. Because the thing we're going to try and do today is slow down and notice the driving forces of change that are sort of pushing us forward into the future. Change is all around us. I know it feels incredibly obvious to say, and sometimes it feels really abrupt and disruptive, but the thing is, most of the time, even in those abrupt, disruptive moments, it's the result of change that is happening over such long time horizons, so slowly, lots and layers of imperceptibly tiny changes, that it's only when they all stack up that we realize, oh my goodness, paradigm shift, I have to have a new sense of the world. So that's what we're trying to do here today. We're trying to slow down a little bit to notice these. Now, how many of you have introduced yourself to someone new already this morning? Show of hands, I know it's early. Great. You're beating me. I've got a little work to do here. Whenever we introduce ourselves to someone new, we draw upon one of the many stories that we hold about ourselves and we share it with them. In this particular sort of context, a lot of times we are sharing a story that is more related to our work, our role, or what we produce. And because I haven't done it yet, because I always forget to, this is a good time for me to say, hi, my name is Jenn Rugolo, and I am the curatorial director at the Specialty Coffee Association. I've worked in specialty coffee for almost 20 years now, and around half of that time I have been working in and around the Specialty Coffee Association, either as a volunteer or as staff. So even if you haven't seen me before, I've kind of been in the background and around. Other times we may want to introduce ourselves drawing on more sort of personal information, our attributes, quirks, the things that we sort of think about make us who we are. I would suppose I'd say I am a recovering academic, which is a very short story with a long sort of narrative behind it we won't get into. I'm a visual learner, and I like complexity in my ideas, but also in my coffee. And I'm a bit of a shut-in, a little bit of an introvert. It's really difficult for me to be here today. The third thing we often draw upon is a sense of where we're from in the sort of literal sense, or where we are right now geographically. Again, show of hands, how many of you really love to lead with this kind of story about yourself because you're really excited about where you're from or where you are now? Anybody? Oh, wow. Okay, great. So I'm mostly in keeping with this audience because I really struggle to sort of cover that area. First of all, because it's fairly complicated, I have spent more than half of my life living on the other side of the ocean than in the place I grew up in, and I moved around a lot. But also because up until very recently, I would always encounter this situation whenever I was introducing myself to people. I'd say, oh, I've recently moved to the UK, and they would sort of, their eyes would light up and they go, great, how's London? Isn't it amazing? And again, up until very recently, I probably would have gone, yeah, it's fantastic, because it's true, and because I do go there occasionally, but I'm an hour and a half away on the fast train, and London is not my sort of experience. Nowadays, I have begun to say, oh no, I'm out in the Midlands of the UK, and it's a little town, you probably never heard of it, it's called Stafford. Now, I've known about Stafford for about 12 of my 15 to 18 coffee years, and that's because I used to work very closely with a roastery there. And as sort of phone meetings turned into day trips, turned into week-long meetings, I spent a lot of time there, and I began to develop relationships and grow friendships. And this one thing always kept coming up. They would always sort of go, oh man, so sorry you have to be here in Stafford. It's a little bit boring, nothing ever happens, it's not a great place to be. You always have to come to this industrial estate. And over time, I developed this sense that the middle of the UK was full of these beautiful, interesting, special places of areas of outstanding natural beauty or of interesting history and sort of the role of the Industrial Revolution. But then there were these other places, and they were kind of suburban yet industrial, kind of transitory, liminal places where the history is a little bit wonky and mishmashed, and Stafford is kind of one of those places. So you can imagine then that it would have been kind of a weird situation for me to be in, to willingly decide to move to this place that I had spent the better part of a decade kind of, making fun of with my friends. But love does strange things to you, and so I picked up and I went. And when I moved there, it felt like my worst fears about Stafford were kind of confirmed. And like I said, I'm a shut-in, so I kind of dug myself into a rut. For example, my neighborhood has a street that's named after an electric company, which feels really weird until I show you that this thing is right behind my house. And if I walk down the road, I am hemmed in by lanes and lanes of train tracks. And everything feels sharp, and it feels a little bit dull and gray. And if I'm honest, I'm sure it really doesn't help that I'm constantly surrounded by this impending sense of doom wherever I walk in my immediate area. Recently, earlier this year, my parents started to plan a visit to come visit me in this new place that they had never seen before. And I could sense this trepidation or this kind of unenthusiasm. I've lived a lot of places. They've always been really excited to come and visit, but this time they seemed a little bit unsure. And immediately I kind of had a chip on my shoulder. I mean, to be fair, I've been making fun of Stafford for 10 years and I've only lived there for about a year, but they've never been there. How could they judge this place before they even got there? And so I sort of set myself a challenge. So what if my surrounding area isn't incredibly beautiful or sort of full of this interesting history that hasn't been papered over in strange ways? I'm going to find something that I can show them. There's got to be something special somewhere. And so, creature of habit, I take my dog on a walk twice a day in our sort of surrounding area, and I decided that every walk I was going to take one new turn. It didn't matter where the turn was or sort of how important or big or different it felt. One new turn, and hopefully I would get a better sense of my surroundings and find maybe something. There's got to be something that's interesting to show them. How many turns do you think it took for me to find something? You want to shout it out? Anybody? 2. 2 turns, and I stumbled upon this interesting looking path that was right next to these sort of like big box houses that were being built, all standard cubes. And it seemed interesting, and I was not brave enough to do 2 new turns in one day. So by the time I was actually to kind of make this my new turn, it felt a little bit like an adventure. Of course, I walked past all the things that seemed eminently Staffordian to me, these big electric towers and train lines and sharp fences and defunct pumping stations. But as I emerged on the other side of the big train tracks that I had to walk underneath, I came upon this place. And as I kept walking, I found this, and then I got here. And these were things and types of places that I had never thought could exist sort of within the realms of Stafford, only outside of it if I got out into the countryside. And I'll admit, I was a little annoyed at myself. It's taken me a while to find this beautiful place to walk. I've been walking on busy roads. Like, what was I thinking? Why hadn't I tried this before? I went, you know what? You couldn't have seen it on a map. That's probably why I didn't notice. And then I got home and I checked the map, and it was actually there. And so I beat myself up a little bit, even more. But pause, because you as a collective group are not my joint therapists, but also rewind, because the whole point of telling this story is to explain what I mean when I say Rico headspace. 3 things get in the way of us being truly generative and creative and sensing the change that's happening around us so that we can adjust to it and begin to respond to it. And they are judgment, cynicism, and fear. Now, of course, I had learned to judge Stafford early on from the friends and the relationships that I had built there, but I can't lay the blame entirely at their feet. In fact, I can't lay the blame at their feet at all because, well, first, they have a complicated relationship to Stafford, and they have many stories about it, and that was just one of the many stories they had shared with me because they thought I might connect with it as a little bit of an outsider. But also second, because I was already primed to judge Stafford. You see, I had read Jane Austen, and I learned about the North and South divide and the class divides in England and how the South was special and cultured and interesting, and the North was interesting in a different way, but more industrial and hardworking and a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. And then I learned about the Industrial Revolution in school and the role that the Midlands played in sort of developing and shaping the world that we live in today, for better and for worse. I also moved around a lot as a kid in the US, and so I was very familiar with this idea that there's Anywhere USA. You've got big box stores or strip malls that if you never sort of leave their vicinity, you wouldn't actually know where you were. And then I moved to Ireland. And I spent a lot of time there, but as I'm sure most of you know, the relationship between Ireland and the UK is a little bit complicated, and so I began to absorb the sense of what it might be like to live with the Brits. And of course, while I was living there, I read many newspapers, and I was constantly seeing these headlines about the fact that the high street, the sort of heart of these communities in the middle and in the north of the country, they were being hollowed out and they were being devastated. And this was long before COVID even hit and sort of pushed that further. There was no sense of community and no sense of place. So I had, in many ways, already built these layers of understanding long over time, like the better part of 30 years, before I ever moved there. And all of these things had sort of stacked up to the point where they had dug foundations deep in the ground. And so when my new friends in Stafford told me it was an industrial place, and it was boring, and it was transitional, and nothing interesting was going to ever happen there, I built a house right on top of it. And then when I moved there, my cynicism only grew because I had this story in my head, and then I was primed to see it everywhere I went. I started to ignore the things that otherwise in other places where I didn't already hold that judgment, I probably would have seen as special or interesting. And of course, the other thing I did too, like most of us, is you develop another layer of your own identity, another story that you hold on to of yourself. And in this case, one of my news stories was that I was somebody who lived in Stafford, but I actively fought against it. And here's the funny thing about identities or a sense of the world. It's really hard to let go of them. Our brains are not programmed to do it. It truly evokes a fear response. So when I say Rico mindset, the only thing that moved me from being in a place where Stafford was sort of suburban, yet industrial, boring, transitional, liminal, into one where maybe there is something interesting here, was the moment at which my mindset actually shifted. It was that idea that perhaps there could be something special here, even if I hadn't seen it before. It's almost like a magic eye painting. So you can see all of these different things on the screen, lots of these different colors, and they're layered on top of each other. But if you begin to really soften your focus, and I don't know if you'll be able to do it, sometimes I struggle with this one, you'll see the image that's in the picture. And all of these things are true. All of these different elements of what you see and what you don't see unless you soften your focus, they're all there all the time. So I began to do this sort of a little bit with Stafford, and I could see that, yes, this is a beautiful space. It's really interesting, but this too is incredibly industrial. So these raised sort of brick things and this long walkway, that's because this is a watershed area and it floods regularly, and the trains, as I said, sort of hem Stafford in. It's kind of in the middle of the country, and it's really important to keep goods and people moving around. And so this is here to keep the train lines from flooding. And even this is not a river, it's a canal. And canals were integral to the Industrial Revolution because they were how goods and people were moved around the country before trains ever existed. This is an incredibly industrial place, despite its beauty. And even this thing. Once I really had gotten into the space where I realized that maybe what I thought I knew wasn't actually the whole story, I was able to find that this is not what it looks like. It's not a relic of an era that we're actively trying to move away from in terms of energy consumption. It is a giant cathedral-sized Faraday cage that is currently being used to test tiny pieces of technology that are going to be able to help us transition from renewable energy gathered offshore and move them into the homes and offices of the future. So that's what I mean when I say moving into a RICO headspace. It feels a little bit therapy speak to say it, but it's about being in the moment and very present. It's about being open to new ideas, even if they resonate a little bit oddly. And so I would like to ask you to notice your reactions. If something new sort of crops up and you realize it's a bit jarring in terms of how you see the world, just note it, set it aside, come back to it later. Chances are it will teach you something interesting about yourself. And then the other thing about this headspace is about acknowledging the blind spots in our lives. So often we sort of overlook our own role or our own history in terms of how our perceptions sort of tell us about the world. And so it's really important that we see ourselves in all of this as well, if we truly want to be able to sense the emerging future. So that's what we're doing today. Our program has hopefully been designed. Like I said, it's a container. We don't know how it's going to work until you're here and you're interacting with it. But hopefully been designed to help you slow down and notice those driving forces of change. So sort of pick up on those imperceptible things before they layer up and they truly sort of, you find yourself in a place where the world you thought you knew isn't actually there. This is hopefully going to help you flip the switch. Because I think it's really ambitious to assume that at the end of 2 days, we are going to walk away being able to see the entire sort of multiverse of possibilities or truths that are simultaneously true all over the place. But I do think that if we can sort of soften our focus and kind of begin to see that there are other stories that are true at the same time as our own, we'll be able to actually sense the emerging future and be able to, in say, maybe a few weeks or months or even years, notice those tiny imperceptible changes as they happen rather than being shocked by them when they land all at once. Now, usually at this stage of the program, I would begin to explain what to expect. But you all have just heard me tell you a story about what happens when you build up expectations too long over time. And you've already come here with your own expectations. You've made the decision to be here and you've checked the schedule. So rather than sort of me telling you what to expect, we're all just going to kind of go on this journey together. I want you to trust me and later Kim when we say that we're going to tell you what you need to know about the program when you need to know it. And hopefully that's going to keep us in this very present space where we can do what we say we are going to do. Now, it's an idea that I've picked up from our first speaker today, and I'm very excited to welcome him to the stage. I followed his work for a while, and he was a speaker at RICO previously. He works a lot in this idea of uncertainty and not knowing and how we can sort of harness that. And without further ado, I'm just going to let him tell you all about it. Please welcome Von Dan. Okay.